In this session, we'll take a look at how capitalism has struggled to deal with the falling rate of profit, to give you a flavour of its impact on the historical events of the last century or so, and an idea about how we got to where we are today, a period dominated by the set of ideas, policies, and practices known as neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is, or has been, the latest of several distinct phases in the recent history of capitalist society. Each ended by the outbreak of a crisis more dangerous than the last. These crises inevitably arise from the internal contradictory forces at work within the system itself. The end of every phase in its evolution demands a rejection of the old ideas used to justify its exploitation of peoples and planet, and a search for new theories and actions that enable it, always temporarily, to recover and restart. We'll look at what might come next later in the course. The economy in the period before 1914 was dominated by capitalism expanding around the globe. Politically, this was the golden age of classical liberal capitalism, which was the dominant ideology of the era, especially in Britain. It was founded upon an individualist market economy, private property in the means of production, free trade, open competition, government intervention to protect property rights and resolve market failures. The idea was that the greatest possible number of economic decisions should be made by individuals or households, rather than by collective institutions or organizations. By 1914, however, the global economy faced external and internal stresses from the clash of empires. The rising economic powers of Germany and the United States pursued protectionist trade policies, providing an apparent counter to the liberal belief in the superiority of free trade. This was the collapse of the century-old ideology of classical liberalism. The Second Industrial Revolution of the latter part of the 19th century induced a period of expansion. It increased demand for raw materials and an imperialist competition for control of territories and markets, ending in the Great War of 1914-18. During the war, productive capacity was turned over to the forces of destruction, and tens of millions were wounded and died. The 1917 October Revolution in Russia removed a huge swathe of territory from capitalist control. Here, it's important to note that war, the extreme destructive power unleashed by capitalism at its moments of greatest crisis, doesn't arise from an external source, but is a necessary consequence of its tendency to overproduction and the competition for resources. Rebuilding after the war invoked the oil-fueled decade known as the Roaring Twenties. It saw rapid industrial and economic growth. This came from dramatically increased productivity through electrification and the introduction of diesel-powered farm machinery. Techniques of mass production fed into accelerated consumer demand, which in turn induced soaring stock market values. The result was overproduction and overvalued assets. The bubble burst in 1929 with the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression, which engulfed most of the world's national economies. With mass unemployment and widespread destitution lasting for more than a decade and fueling the rise of fascism, economic activity in the private sector remained sluggish until 1938. This was despite US President Roosevelt's New Deal programs of government spending, influenced by the proposals of British economist John Maynard Keynes. It wasn't until 1937 when rearmament for a return to the unfinished war began in Europe, and subsequently in the USA, that saw the return to increased economic activity funded by huge increases in forced saving and taxation. Nothing compares to the scale of production devoted to highly profitable destruction during the Second World War, when governments took control of their economies. Britain's defence spending rose from 9% of GDP in 1939 to 52% in 1945. Before joining the war in 1941, US government spending was 30% of GDP, about $408 billion. By 1944, at the peak of war, US government spending, raised largely from taxes and debt, had risen fourfold to over $1.6 trillion, about 79% of GDP. Much of it was spent on munitions, especially firebombing cities in Germany and Japan, and, of course, the first deployment of nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. When the war ended, much of Europe, the Soviet Union and Japan was left in ruins, and many more than 70 million people were killed. But a great amount of surplus productive capacity had been destroyed, and many new technologies invented. Restarting capitalist production began after a conference of the victorious Allied nations in 1944. They adopted the Bretton Woods Agreement, a set of rules establishing fixed currency exchange rates, controls on trade and the supply of money, and institutions to manage them. Much of the inspiration for the agreement came from Keynes, whose challenge to the reliance on the operation of free markets, formulated and implemented in the USA and Japan during the Great Depression, was eventually adopted by most capitalist governments. In Britain, Keynes worked with William Beveridge, whose proposals, published in November 1942, formed the basis of the welfare state. With much of old, less productive capital destroyed, and a plethora of new technologies spun off from war production, the relative, if uncomfortable, stability provided by Bretton Woods kick-started the period called the Golden Age of capitalist production. It was a period of high and rising profitability, but it wasn't to last. Bretton Woods was built on dreams. False hopes of continuing future profits and unfolding geopolitical events tempted governments and banks into inflationary monetary expansion. The US printed new dollars to fund its assault on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. By the mid-60s, profitability went into reverse as workers fought for higher wages, and the period of growth ran out of steam. 1968 saw mobilization throughout the US and much of the capitalist world, spurred on by the Vietnam War, which arrived at a revolutionary crisis in France. Bretton Woods broke down 27 years after it was signed, when on August 15, 1971, US President Nixon severed the exchange relationship between the dollar and gold. That was $35 to the ounce, which had been one of the foundations of the agreement. Keynesianism and Bretton Woods was ended. The soaring of prices that followed, together with the profitability crisis, opened the door to another way of thinking. Oil prices quadrupled. Then the 1970s period of stagflation, that's simultaneous but supposedly mutually exclusive stagnation and inflation, meant that governments had to look elsewhere for ways of dealing with declining profitability. The decline persisted until the 1980s, when neoliberal policies began to be more widely adopted and to take effect. The origins of neoliberalism lie in the early 1920s, in the work of Austrian economist and sociologist Ludwig von Mises, an altogether nasty piece of work. His was a response to the powerful organizations of German and Austrian workers. He advocated collectivist collaboration between the classes as a means of justifying the concentration of capital, the subordination of the state to the market, and an anti-socialist system of social control. Mises became economic advisor to the Austro-fascist dictator Engelbert Dollfuss, and he argued for corporate tax cuts, balanced budgets, wage cuts, and the repression of trade unions. In 1938, the Walter Lippmann Colloquium was an attempt to respond to the social, economic, and political crisis that persisted following the 1914-1918 war. Its participants, which included von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, proposed a new liberalism, rejecting collectivist and laissez-faire liberalism and socialism. Hence, neoliberalism, or, as it became known, classical liberalism on steroids. But the Second World War intervened before their ideas could take centre stage. In 1947, as Bretton Woods took over from the government-directed war economy, Friedrich Hayek launched the Mont Pelerin Society, part funded by the Bank of England. Its participants, including Milton Friedman, set out to discuss how to combat the state ascendancy and Marxist or Keynesian planning that was sweeping the globe. But neoliberal concepts and policies had to wait a further 24 years for the 1971 collapse of the Bretton Woods Agreement. Then came the turning point. Neoliberal policies were first trialled in Chile by the Pinochet dictatorship following the CIA-inspired brutal overthrow of the Allende government in 1973. Pinochet turned to the Chicago Boys, a group of Chilean economists who'd been trained by Milton Friedman in the dark neoliberal arts. In 1976, under attack from investors in the international currency markets, the British Labour government was obliged to take what was then the largest ever loan from the IMF. Its mandatory cuts in public expenditure and reduction of the budget deficit marked a transitional moment in the roles of the IMF, national governments, and the Labour Party in succumbing to the new neoliberal regime. The IMF went on to impose structural adjustment on country after debt-strapped country in Latin America and elsewhere in exchange for loans, demanding that they privatise state-run businesses and open their economies to investment by foreign corporations. In 2022, the Mont Pelerin Society is 75 years old. It has continued to meet regularly with a general meeting every 2 years and annual regional meetings. Many associated think tanks were initiated and gathered into a global network funded by oil and tobacco corporations and other interested parties like the Koch family foundations. Neoliberal influence is spread through a global network of think tanks sponsored and assisted by the Atlas Economic Research Foundation, amongst others. By 2022, Atlas Network claimed it had more than 500 partner organizations in almost 100 countries. Corporations and others, including the Koch foundations, provide funding for Atlas and a wide range of right-wing and libertarian think tanks and other lobbying organizations. Their influence on governments around the world and on the management of the global economy has been and continues to be profound. So what are the key features of neoliberalism? There's the freedom and rights of the individual to own and do whatever that individual wants to do with private property, which is a foundational principle of capitalist society. There's capturing and redefining the role of the state to strengthen market-oriented economic systems, and deregulation, reducing controls on trade and, critically, finance. Democracy becomes weaker as the influence of transnational corporations operating within and across nation-states strengthens. They reduce the influence of trade unions. Margaret Thatcher launched an all-out assault on trade unions during the 1984 miners' strike. Governments around the world have enacted legislation making it increasingly difficult for unions to take effective action. They've transformed employment relations with the shift to precarious working, which effectively ends the employment contract. Then there's privatisation of state-owned industries and services, the establishment of a permanent state of austerity for the majority. They've reduced and eventually want to eliminate public sector welfare state services, including social care, housing, health, and education. As a result, service provision becomes a collection of conduits transferring government tax income to the shareholders of organisations operating in the private sector. Let's look at some of the key elements of the strategy. The neoliberal era depended upon the creation of an international order that eliminates constraints on the movement of capital, safeguarding its newly acquired rights to travel across national boundaries. In the 1980s, the British government of Margaret Thatcher set out on a path of reducing controls over banking and the financial sector, notably in the Big Bang. This freed the stock exchange and allowed different sectors of banking to merge as electronic trading began. London rapidly became a world financial centre, and the UK economy became increasingly dependent upon it. In the USA, the 1933 New Deal-era Glass-Steagall legislation regulating banking, which had restored confidence in the financial system, was revoked in 1999. The imperative of unceasing, restless expansion saw the emergence of a transnational capitalist class to help it on its way, advancing the interests of highly mobile global corporations which have become more powerful than nation-states. These transnational employers move production to countries where trade unionism is impaired or non-existent, further undermining unions' effectiveness in their home countries. Much of production was transferred to low-wage economies in China and Latin America, and then on to other countries offering even more advantageous conditions. States have become subordinate to and obliged to compete for investment from capitalist corporations. From negotiations initiated at Bretton Woods, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which eventually produced the World Trade Organization, provided the forum for global rules which enabled the growth and influence of transnational corporations. Neoliberal policies transformed the roles of world-level institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which were also established by Bretton Woods. From attempting to stabilize trading and monetary relationships between countries to enable post-war reconstruction and cooperation, they became agents of transnational corporations. Pressure to reduce taxation on corporate profits saw countries leaping over each other in a race to the bottom. Since the late 1980s, Ireland has provided a notional home for many of the US-controlled global corporations' European operations. It has become known as the world's largest tax haven. In 1999, Ireland's headline rate of corporate tax of 32% was slashed to 12.5%, less than half. But that wasn't good enough for the corporations. Using a range of multinational tax schemes and treaties, the effective rate they paid on global profits shifted to Ireland ranged from 2.2 to 4.5%, disappearingly small. These two processes, globalization and financialization, demanded each other. They made each other possible. Neoliberalism found its way into every aspect of society, not least as the ballooning of debt needed to sustain the illusion of growth and prosperity spread through global financial networks. Above all, it constantly seeks novel ways to enable capital to overcome its problems. By 1983, the crisis of declining profitability that had emerged in the late 1960s and helped to precipitate the end of Bretton Woods had reached its lowest point. Then, neoliberal policies began to gain traction, helping to restore capital's fortunes, but for only 15 years. Then the party was over. The economy was racked by a series of national and international recessions, stock market crashes, slumps, and financial shocks. In 1997, a financial crisis erupted in Asia, raising fears of global contagion, and profitability turned downwards once again. This was followed rapidly by the 1998 Russian financial crisis, the dot-com bubble at the turn of the millennium, and onwards to the great financial crash of 2007-2008. The capitalist response was as shocking as it was dramatic. From the turn of the millennium, the total amount of profits increased, as did inequality in wealth and income, arising from a sharp divide in the shares of GDP received by labour and that taken by the owners of capital. This is no coincidence. The share received by, or we should say returned to labour, that's the workers in red on this graph, who are the source of all value, as you'll remember, declines, because the share taken as profit by the owners of capital in blue increases. The divergence was particularly sharp in the United States, especially between the year 2000 and 2012, when profits soared in the period of austerity for the many following the crash. The result is extreme and accelerating concentration of wealth for the few and debilitating poverty for the vast majority. Then, with the acceleration of precarious working for the many, things got a whole lot worse. Capitalism is supposedly dependent on achieving growth of at least 3% year on year, but nothing could stop the relentless decline of the world rate. From its high point of 6.5% in 1964 to 4.4% just before the 2007 crash, its plunge into negative territory of -1% in 2009 and way beyond to -3% in 2020 following the arrival of the pandemic. All of the measures forced on the world in the name of neoliberalism failed to stop the rot. Capital investment followed the decline in the rate of profit, but some corporations grew and increased their power and influence through mergers and acquisitions, reducing their numbers to a handful in each sector. The era of allowing and encouraging the markets supposedly free rein to resolve all eventualities could only continue with the ongoing assault on living standards and massive, eye-watering, jaw-dropping injections of credit by governments and central banks. But hey, not everything declines. As you can see, globally, the ratio of debt to GDP grew from 1970, when it was approximately equal, or 100%, to almost double at the time of the 2007 global crisis. Quantitative easing, near and below zero interest rates are just some of the new tricks they added to the house of cards. But they could only postpone the inevitable. Globalization went into reverse. With Trump and Brexit, economic nationalism was back in vogue. Then came the pandemic. governments responded with a new record surge of debt, raising the total higher than 250% of GDP. Debt outstanding now exceeds by more than 2.5 times the value produced during the year. You can guess who's going to have to pay for the loan. Capitalism is surely nearing the end of the process that began with the 19th century Industrial Revolution and the dramatic expansion in the wake of the destruction of the Second World War. We'll expand on some of these big issues as we bring things up to date in the next section.